MICRE, Microservices in Medical Research Environments. I want to talk a little bit today about how the microservice development paradigm can impact the quality of software developed in health informatics. There are a number of benefits to utilizing the microservice design paradigm, specifically in terms of the impact on the quality of software that's able to be produced in health informatics. Perhaps the primary benefit of a microservice architecture is the fact that we can produce these resilient and scalable architectures. So what I mean by that is when we have a set of microservices, if one of them happens to fail, then it's quite straightforward to spin up another copy of it and run that in its place. So we get this level of resilience. In terms of scalability, if our system experiences some unexpected throughput, a large number of users asking or taking from the resources of the system by making requests to it, then again we can replicate our services, but this time not to replace a failing service, but to run alongside the same service. So we have multiple copies of the same service, and they're able to collectively service this higher demand that's being placed upon the system. Why are these things particularly important for health informatics? Well, the key is the notion of the end user. So much of the research that's taking place in health informatics is intrinsically linked to end users. So let's imagine, for example, a clinical decision support system that uses artificial intelligence to support patients. The development of that system is intrinsically linked to end users. You can't develop an AI system to help end users without involving end users in the research process. Therefore, if you want to embody this theoretical AI process in a software system, that software system has to be able to effectively interact with end users so the research can take place. Of course, if you design this piece of software in a traditional sense as a monolithic architecture, it's not going to be able to do so. It's not going to be able to handle these error situations that are brought about by using software out in the wild, as it were. It's not necessarily going to be able to handle large throughput, large number of users, especially if you're running large research studies with lots of remote users. So here is a place in which these benefits that are brought by the microservice paradigm really can help the quality of research software developed in health informatics. The second properties brought by a microservice architecture are the notions of technological heterogeneity and composability, two sort of linked concepts. The first, in terms of technical heterogeneity, is this notion that I can have multiple services running, and what's actually supporting those services, what language has actually been used to realize the logic of those services doesn't really matter, because they're all wrapped in similar containers and they all communicate in a standard way. Why is this important for health informatics research again? Well, again, it's in the nature of the name, so health and informatics. This is a very cross-discipline area, often bringing together people from medical backgrounds, people from computer science backgrounds, each of which have their own traditional ways of doing things, and that usually translates to they all have languages that they prefer to use. So for example, you might have medical people who are preferring to use R for kind of stats work, and there'll be people in computer science who would want to do the same work in something like Java. If you're trying to build a monolithic system, it's going to be very hard. There are going to be fights about which type of software to use. But if you use a microservice approach, each person can develop in the language that they like, and then we come along and we wrap that logic in these standard containers, and then the overall system that you produce at the end is a cohesive one. Secondly, we get this notion of composability, which is sort of born of technical heterogeneity in a sense. So if you want to be able to take the microservices developed by someone else, you can very easily do so and very easily integrate them into your system. Again, because it doesn't really matter what's going on underneath the hood. It's just the fact that they have this standard interface available to them. So again, why is this important to health informatics? Well, like much of research, perhaps especially in health informatics because of the software focus, much of what's being created is builds upon existing software systems. So there's often the case in which you want to take something someone else has built and include it into your system. And it's tricky to do so if you and the previous researcher have done so in a monolithic way. But if you're both utilizing the microservice approach, it's a lot easier to do so. Finally, we have this concept of ease of deployment. So the idea that, again, if you're building a monolithic system, you often go through the process of creating the software. You'll go through the process of setting up some server to run that software on, manually installing services and packages and applications that you need. Whereas with the microservice approach, this is typically all taken care of, all defined within the architecture itself. So it's very, very easy if you want to make another copy of an application and spin it up and run it. Now, that's again important for two reasons in terms of health informatics research. The first is scientific reproducibility. So if someone else has built a health system where they've run some experiments, perhaps some processing of patient data, and they've built a platform to do that and they've done it in a monolithic way, it's going to be tricky and time consuming for you to take that platform, download the code, rerun it, really figure out what environment they were using. Whereas if they've done so in a microservice manner, then it's very easy for you to, again, through the ease of deployment principle, respin up that experiment platform, rerun those results, and verify that the results that have been obtained by your research colleagues are reproducible in your environment. So again, it's the contribution towards the reproducibility of research via the microservice approach. Second, there's this notion of software sustainability, which is good for software in general and especially for research software. So again, if you build a monolithic architecture, difficult to maintain, often very tightly coupled to the underlying hardware. Whereas if you build a microservice architecture, again with this ease of deployment principle, it's very easy to migrate the system, say from one piece of hardware to another, as over time as that hardware improves and changes. Very easy to maintain it. So it's more likely that your software will endure and be useful going forward. There are, of course, some drawbacks to using microservices for research in health informatics, like there usually is with anything. So first of all, there's a level of complexity. So if you're a researcher that's not used this approach before, there can be quite a high barrier to entry. And of course, there's the notion of cost as well. So if you're replicating your services to meet demand, obviously those services need to run somewhere. That might be additional virtual machines, which is obviously going to cost you some money. Microservices for medical research. What is needed? In order to enable microservices to be effectively integrated into the working patterns of health informatics researchers, there are three key things that need to happen. The first, and perhaps most important, is the development of an implementation model that says exactly what form these microservice architectures should take when they're realized in health informatics. At the basic level, this could be dictating things like the language that should be used for each constituent service, the notion of technological heterogeneity aside for a moment, or, for example, dictating how the services are going to communicate. So, for example, which technologies are going to be used, such as HTTP or perhaps RPC. The second thing that needs to occur, at least in the short term, is the introduction of certain tooling that will allow for this pattern to be unobtrusively integrated into researchers' working paradigms. So the simplest way to do this would be through something like an IDE, an integrated development environment. So we could, for example, imagine a graphical interface from one of these IDEs, and what we would do is a researcher would be able to graphically define their architecture as a microservice architecture. They could have little boxes representing each service, for example, and they could graphically connect them to show that they want to be connected. Or they could indeed take an existing architecture, run it through this software, and it could automatically transform it into a microservice architecture and deploy it. So it's all about unobtrusively, easily, in the short term, integrating the paradigm into the working practices of researchers. In the long term, obviously, to embed the microservice paradigm into the working practices of researchers, and this is the third point, the third thing that needs to happen, is training. So information about the paradigm needs to be presented to up-and-coming health informatics researchers, say at the postdoctoral level, the master's level, to kind of really embed the paradigm into the working practices of researchers in the long term. This kind of training needs to be delivered. Today, what I want to focus on is an initial model, so answering the first requirement, the first thing that needs to happen, an initial model for the development of microservices. It's not a complete, not a full implementation model. What it is instead is more of a lightweight workflow, a set of steps that dictate how software should be developed in health informatics in order to realize this microservice design pattern. These 3 steps are as follows. So first of all, you want to design your individual server components. You want to actually build the logic of the logic that's going to be produced, that's going to be part of your microservice architecture. You want to realize that as a set of individual components, each of which will then operate like a little server. And you'll be doing that in a language like JavaScript. That's what this workflow would dictate. And the communication technique that will be used to interact between those little programmatic servers will be HTTP. The second step in the workflow will be to containerize those components, so moving closer and closer towards an actual easy to deploy, easily replicable microservice architecture. And the final step will then to be actually to go ahead and deploy those containers somewhere, make a decision about which virtual machine am I going to deploy this to, how many virtual machines am I going to deploy this to, really bringing in the remote element of deployment there. So as an example of this, let's imagine that we have a little bit of code with the functionality of this code being to allow a user to download a zip file. Following this workflow through, the first thing that a user would do would be to realize their logic using appropriate libraries and appropriate syntax in JavaScript. They'd write this code out, and in doing so obviously undertake as part of the workflow appropriate version control and production of tests to enable continuous integration tests, perhaps as a part of that version control process. They then take that little bit of logic realized in JavaScript and add in another framework, a web framework, Express.js, that would allow essentially this functionality to be wrapped in an endpoint, in a root, in some sort of endpoint for an API that can be invoked via HTTP. So we take our little bit of JavaScript, we plug it into the Express.js library, we essentially annotate the functionality with some root information, and then we go ahead and we can run that little bit of code directly, and what it will operate as is a little programmatic server to which we can send HTTP requests to and get a response. And we're now really starting to create the structure of our microservice architecture with a single service just for now that can accept requests and perform some action based upon those requests by existing as a little programmatic server. The next step would be to encapsulate this inside a container, inside a Docker container. So what we would do is we would write out an image that's going to dictate the structure of that container that says, look, this is the little bit of code I want to run, which is the Express server, which in turn contains this zip functionality. So we have almost this layered approach. So we start off with our basic functionality, which is the zip functionality. We add the programmatic web server around the outside, which is some root, some endpoint that can be called to invoke that functionality, typically by other microservices or by users. And then we wrap it again inside this Docker container by writing out this Docker file. What we do then is we start to think about actually what's the ecosystem here, what are the other services that are going to exist alongside my service, alongside my little bit of zip functionality. And we do this using Docker Compose. So we'll first of all talk about our we'll write out in our Docker Compose file, we'll mention this zip functionality, the little programmatic server, which we're going to call our main web app. So remember again, that's the zip functionality wrapped in Express.js, wrapped in a Docker container, and this is now being referenced from inside our Docker Compose file. Then alongside that, we're now going to think about what are the other services we want to run alongside that. What other services is it going to communicate with as a part of our microservice architecture? And 2 basic things are obviously a database service. So here inside our Docker Compose, we're going to talk about MariaDB. We'll talk about we'll state the existence of a database service that our main app is going to communicate with. And typically we'll also add a proxy, obviously often acting as a reverse proxy, so something like Nginx. And that's going to exist really to serve a utility function to do things like enabling HTTPS communication rather than straight HTTP. And if these services end up existing on their own virtual machine and there are other services on other virtual machines, it can be quite a nice, useful gateway into that virtual machine. So we're starting to build up now towards our full microservice architecture. As part of this workflow for integrating microservices, for developing microservices, if you're building a piece of software for health informatics, this is the process, the workflow that you'd go through in order to do that. You start with this little bit of JavaScript functionality, you wrap it in a programmatic server, wrap it in a Docker container, state what other services you want running alongside in Docker Compose. And the final step is to use Docker machine. So what we'll do is we'll have this extra application now, Docker machine, which we'll use to actually create the environment in which this microservice is going to run. So using Docker machine, we can create remote hosts. We can create remote virtual machines, for example, on something like OpenStack. And Docker machine will automatically configure that host to receive Docker images to run as containers to actually run our microservice architecture. So we'll do something like Docker machine create, which will spin up this virtual machine, ready to receive our containers, ready to run our containers. We'll connect to that machine, we'll build everything, we'll spin up the containers, and then we'll be running our microservice architecture. So again, Docker machine sits at the top. It can provision these remote hosts. It can effectively run containers on these remote hosts. It can run our other microservices as well. And this is how we build our complete architecture. So we have several examples of where this architecture has been used effectively. 3 examples, 3 different research environments in which it's been used successfully to structure software that exhibits, that's of high quality, that's able to exhibit some of the properties we've seen earlier. It's able to have different technologies under the hood. It's able to be scalable. It's able to be easily deployed and allow for sustainable software. First of these is in the area of phenomics. So when we talk about phenotyping, obviously, it's got lots of different definitions. In this case, we're really using it to describe different diseases within a group of patients. So you could have a phenotype, for example, relating to COVID-19. And when we talk about phenotype definitions, we talk about how do we write the logic that can automatically identify that disease based upon, for example, some of the features of the patients in a population. How can we write that logic? How can we describe how to automatically identify a disease within a set of patients? And when we talk about a computable phenotype, we essentially talk about the programming, the actual implemented logic that can actually be run and executed against a patient data set and automatically identify those patients, a cohort of patients that exhibit this phenotype, that exhibit this condition. So let's imagine we had, as I said, a COVID-19 phenotype. We can imagine a situation in which we write some logic for identifying that. We run this against a set of health records, and we can automatically identify patients from that. Obviously, that's hugely advantageous if we want to support the operation of a piece of AI, because it's, again, something that's happening autonomously. So I talked a little bit about the difference between phenotype definition and computable phenotype. Translating between the two is something that's an active area of research. So one place in which we contributed to microservice architecture was to this application called Phenoflow, which allows you to both author definitions and translate them into a computable form. So here we have the Phenoflow architecture, fairly straightforward, but does exhibit some nice properties of the microservice architecture. At the core of this, we have our web portal, our web service, which provides the main endpoint for users to interact both programmatically or graphically in order to create definitions. It's got a service sitting alongside it like we've seen, a database service that's supporting it. And then also we have these other 2 services. So again, it's here where composability really comes into play, which is nice. We've got this visualizer service, which is entirely taken from a previous research project. It's previous research impacting new research directly, an example of that. So the previous researchers who had built this visualizer had done so using a microservice paradigm. So it was very, very trivial for us to integrate that into our work because of that. Again, seeing the benefits of composability. With the generator, again, not necessarily already built as a microservice, so not necessarily composable. But again, here we were seeing the benefits of technological heterogeneity in the sense that this was something that was built in Python, whereas what we built was in JavaScript. And we were able to easily plug the 2 together, again, by wrapping these things in services where what's actually going on under the hood doesn't really matter too much. Our second use case is for clinical guidelines, which are guidelines that are given to medical practitioners in order to dictate how they should administer care to patients. And again, an active area of research is, first of all, how do you represent these clinical guidelines formally so they can be processed by a machine? And second of all, how do we identify interactions, say contradictions between guidelines? Because when you have these huge medical knowledge bases, you can often get inconsistencies, and it's important to identify this. So in terms of microservices, our work here was an entirely one of restructuring. So we took an existing monolithic application that was designed for determining and representing and determining interactions between guidelines and completely redesigned it according to a microservice approach and showed the benefits accordingly. So we have here 3 services again. Much like Phenoflow, we have our user interaction service, which is responsible for interacting with users. We have our reasoner service, which holds the main logic of the program. And we have our storage service, which provides a backend for the reasoner. And again, we saw the benefits here in terms of creating a much more intelligible architecture, one that was much easier to recreate, and of course, one that hopefully promotes scientific reproducibility. Another thing that we did when we were restructuring this architecture is introduce a standard API, both for the interaction between the services and for interaction from users. So again, this shows this kind of side benefit of the microservice approach, which is that when you talk about the interaction between services, you've got to formalize how that happens, and that's usually done by saying, this is my API, this is what my endpoints look like. And that again brings side benefits in terms of interoperability, kind of encouraging interaction with your application, not just from humans, but from machines, if you have this kind of standard API endpoint. Our final research use case for microservices in terms of clinical decision support systems, specifically the Consult system, which could be described as a next-generation clinical decision support system, because it's designed to take data from a variety of sources, including wearable medical devices, electronic health records, and also collections of clinical guidelines like we've already seen, combine them all inside an AI reasoner, and give some recommendations or healthcare support back to a patient in order to really enable this self-management of treatment, specifically for patients with chronic conditions such as stroke patients. And here we really did leverage the microservice functionality to its full extent. You can see there's a large number of microservices here. There are a couple of clear benefits to using microservices here. First of all, it's fair to say that there was a lack of familiarity among the developers on this research project, in this research use case, about how to use the paradigm. We came across the situation discussed at the beginning of technological heterogeneity, where we had different researchers from different backgrounds, each familiar with different types of technology. And the fact that microservices allow those technologies to talk was a big selling point for the use on the project. A second benefit was the ability to segment these services across multiple machines. So particularly in a use case like this, where we've got sensitive medical information, it was very important for us to be able to have different machines that had different levels of security. So for example, for our patient data, we wanted to be able to say, yes, we're going to store this on a controlled, secure, centralized machine. It's not going to be accessible from the internet, for example. But obviously things like the device services, they have to access the internet and they have to be accessible, as indeed do obviously the patient-facing services. So the ability to segment our application into microservices, each of which can exist on different virtual machines with different levels of security, yet still communicate, was very useful and very, very important. We've got a couple of other examples of microservice architectures. One is designed for the analysis of COVID-19 data. So this leverages Jupyter Hub. It tailors Jupyter Hub to COVID-19 analysis. Using the microservice almost blueprint approach, we're able to say that if you want to spin up this architecture yourself to analyze a COVID-19 dataset, these are the packages that you can use. These are available for you. And another example is the Nexus automated programming architecture, which again really relies on this idea of composability. So it's the idea that you can configure your automated programming marking architecture, this Nexus architecture, depending on different modules that perform different automated marking tasks, depending on what your needs are, and you can kind of plug them together and work within the architecture. Or indeed, you can add new modules when you need to if you want to add additional functionality. All of these architectures or information about them are either available open source or are detailed in research papers, with links being available. There are obviously some advancements that need to be made to the workflow model in order to tailor it even further to health informatics, in order to turn it more into what looks like an implementation model and thus fulfill this first requirement for integrating microservices. There are a couple of examples here. So first of all, part of the workflow really needs to be some sort of container management approach. so something like Kubernetes or Docker Swarm. So we can really start to leverage the fact that these microservices are scale ready. We can really take advantage of the prospect of making our architecture scalable and resilient. It should really include some review or potential use of other technologies as well as container technologies, things like serverless technologies like AWS Lambda, how they can sit in with the wider architecture. It should explore different technologies. For example, can we move from JavaScript maybe to TypeScript? It could explore different communication mechanisms, say RPC instead of HTTP, and also look into other almost more tooling systems, such as how, for example, can we use continuous deployment for containers? How can we use that as a part of spinning up our containers and deploying them on remote servers?